Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. There are conquerors and then there is Genghis Khan. In a world already accustomed to war, this one man rose from nothing, no palace, no inheritance, no army, and built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, an empire so vast it covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface. He reshaped borders that still exist today, connected civilizations that had never spoken, and left behind a world so thoroughly rearranged that historians still argue about whether he was the greatest monster or the most transformative leader who ever lived. Tonight, we find out. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The world before the storm, the steppes and their people. To understand Genghis Khan, you first have to understand the world that made him, and that world was not a palace or a city or a civilized court with marble floors and painted ceilings. It was grass, endless, rolling, wind-swept grass stretching in every direction farther than the eye could follow. The Mongolian steppe is one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. It is a landscape of extremes. In summer, the sun beats down without mercy on a flat, treeless plain, where temperatures can climb high enough to wilt a man before midday. In winter, the cold descends with a violence that is almost personal. Temperatures drop to -40 degrees and beyond. Blizzards sweep across the open land for days without stopping, burying livestock and killing the unprepared with quiet efficiency. There are no mountains to break the wind, no forest to provide shelter. There is only the grass and the sky and the cold, and whatever you have managed to carry with you. And yet, for thousands of years before the birth of the man who would one day call himself Genghis Khan, people had not only survived this landscape, they had thrived in it. They had made it their home, their kingdom, and their identity. These were the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppe: Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Karits, Naimans, and dozens of other groups, each with their own territory, their own customs, their own chiefs, and their own understanding of the world. They were not primitive. That is a mistake that settled civilizations have always made about nomadic ones. They were sophisticated in precisely the ways that their environment demanded. They could read weather patterns in the movement of clouds. They knew every watering hole across hundreds of miles. They could navigate by stars and wind and the behavior of their horses. They had medicine, music, oral literature, and a sense of honor so refined and so absolute that breaking it could end a man's life before nightfall. The horse was everything. You must understand this. The relationship between the steppe nomad and the horse was not merely practical, it was existential. A man without horses was not simply inconvenienced, he was finished. Horses were wealth, horses were transport, horses were warfare, horses were prestige, horses were life itself. Mongol children learned to ride almost before they learned to walk. Boys were placed on horseback when they were 3 or 4 years old, and by the time they were teenagers they could ride for days at a stretch, shooting arrows at full gallop with an accuracy that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't seen it. The composite bow used by steppe warriors, a remarkable piece of engineering made from horn, wood, and sinew, bent in a shape almost paradoxical until it was strung, could send an arrow with lethal force at distances that exceeded 200 meters. From a moving horse. Think about that for a moment. The gyr, which you might know by its Turkish name, the yurt, was the home of the steppe people, a circular felt dwelling, its wooden lattice walls collapsible, its roof transportable, the entire structure able to be dismantled, loaded onto ox carts, and reassembled within hours. The gyr was not a compromise or a makeshift arrangement. It was a perfectly engineered solution to the problem of life in motion. Inside, it was warm even in the deepest winter cold. The central hearth served as both heat source and the spiritual centre of family life. The layout of a gyr was precise and meaningful. The right side of the entrance was for men and weapons. The left side was for women and domestic goods. The honoured guests sat at the back, opposite the door, facing the hearth. Status, family, and ritual were written into the geography of a single round room. Food on the steppe reflected the landscape. Dairy products were central. Fermented mare's milk, called erag, was the staple drink, mildly alcoholic, sour and rich, drunk in enormous quantities by virtually everyone. Meat, dried or eaten fresh, supplemented the diet. Mongols ate almost every part of an animal, a practical necessity in a world where waste could mean starvation. Grains and vegetables were rare luxuries, obtained through trade or raid, and raiding was normal. This is another thing that must be understood without judgment if this story is to make sense. On the steppe, raiding neighbouring tribes for horses, women and goods was not considered criminal behaviour. It was simply part of life, a recurrent feature of the social landscape as predictable as the seasons. Tribes raided each other. Alliances were formed against common enemies and then dissolved when the common enemy was defeated. Former allies became enemies. Former enemies became allies. Marriages were arranged to cement agreements, and children were sometimes exchanged as hostages to guarantee peace. The entire political system of the steppe was fluid, personal, and built entirely on relationships. There were no kingdoms in the European sense, no fixed borders, no permanent bureaucracies. What there were instead were charismatic leaders who could attract followers through strength, generosity, and the promise of victory. A Mongol chief who won battles and shared his plunder generously could grow his following rapidly. A chief who suffered defeats or kept too much for himself would find his followers drifting away to serve someone more successful. Loyalty was real, but it was earned, and it could be lost. This was the social world of the steppe, dynamic, competitive, and constantly reshuffling. By the 12th century, the steppe world was particularly fractured. The great empires of China to the south regarded the nomadic peoples with a mixture of contempt and dread. The Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China, had spent enormous resources building walls and paying tribute and conducting campaigns against the various steppe peoples. Their preferred strategy was often to play one tribe against another, keeping the nomads divided so that no single leader could unite them and threaten the settled world. This strategy worked more or less for a long time, but it had an unintended consequence. It created generations of Mongol leaders who grew up in a world of perpetual conflict, permanent insecurity, and the constant spectre of betrayal. It shaped men who were hard, ruthless, and intensely suspicious of weakness in any form. The world into which Temüjin was born in the late 12th century was exactly this kind of world, a place of extraordinary harshness and beauty in equal measure, a place where survival required intelligence and strength in equal measure, a place where nothing was guaranteed and everything could be lost overnight. It was not a world that produced comfortable men. It produced survivors, and occasionally from among the survivors, it produced something else entirely. It produced conquerors. Born into chaos. The early life of Temüjin. The year of Temüjin's birth is debated. Most scholars settle on the year 1162, though some argue for 1167. The exact date matters less than the circumstances. He was born near the Onon River in what is now northeastern Mongolia, in a land of birch forests and cold, clear water, a region slightly more sheltered than the open steppe but no less demanding. His father was Yesugei, a minor chief of the Borjigin clan, a man of moderate standing and some reputation as a warrior. His mother was Hoelun, a woman of the Olkunud tribe. Hoelun's own entry into Yesugei's life was not exactly romantic. She had been kidnapped by Yesugei from another man named Chiledu of the Merkit tribe while she was travelling with her new husband. This was, as we have established, not an unusual occurrence on the steppe. It was nevertheless the kind of event that would have consequences, as we'll see later. Yesugei simply stopped Chiledu's party on the road, drove off the man, and took Hoelun home. She would bear Yesugei several children. Temüjin was the eldest. The name Temüjin likely derived from a Tatar leader named Temüjin Uge, whom Yesugei had captured at the time of his son's birth. This was a common naming practice, attaching a child to a recent victory as a kind of commemoration. The name itself may be related to the Mongolian word for iron, though this connection is disputed. Whether or not his name meant iron, there was a certain aptness to it. Iron is what he became. His early childhood was unremarkable by steppe standards. He learned to ride, he learned to hunt, he learned the social hierarchies of his clan and the obligations that came with his father's position. He had two younger brothers, Kasar and Kachiun, and a younger sister, Temülün. There was also a half-brother named Begta, born of another of Yesugei's wives, whose presence would matter later in a way that was not pleasant for anyone involved. By all accounts, young Temüjin was alert and observant. The secret history of the Mongols, the earliest surviving chronicle of his life written in the 13th century, describes him as a boy with fire in his eyes and light in his face. This is the kind of description that historians view with appropriate skepticism. since it tends to appear in the records of people who later became great. But there it is. When Temüjin was around 9 years old, his father decided it was time to arrange his betrothal. This was normal. On the steppe, marriages were arranged early and served political purposes. Yasuge travelled with his young son to the camp of the Olkunud people, his wife Hoelun's tribe, to find a suitable girl. Along the way, they stopped at the camp of a man named Dei Sechen, chief of the Ongirat tribe, and here Yasuge saw Dei Sechen's daughter, a girl named Borte, and was immediately struck by her quality. Dei Sechen, who apparently had good instincts for the long game, agreed to a betrothal. Temüjin would remain with Borte's family for a while, as was custom, while the betrothal was established. Yasuge headed home alone. On the way back, Yasuge stopped at the camp of some Tatars and accepted their hospitality, eating and drinking with them. The Tatars were long-standing enemies of the Borjigin clan, and though they offered food and drink according to the laws of steppe hospitality, they also, apparently, poisoned it. By the time Yasuge reached his own camp 3 days later, he was already dying. He died shortly after sending for his son, and Temüjin, 9 years old, returned home to find himself the nominal head of a family with no power and a great many enemies. What happened next was one of the defining cruelties of his early life. The followers who had served Yasuge, the families who had owed him allegiance, the men who had ridden with him, simply left. They attached themselves to another chief named Targutai of the Taichiut clan, who had his own claim to leadership in the region. They took their horses, their herds, their gurs, and they went. They left Holun and her children essentially alone on the steppe, a widow with no fighting men, no horses of consequence, and no political protection. Abandoned. That is the only word for it. A young boy and his mother and his siblings, abandoned on the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century. Most historians, when they try to explain what Genghis Khan became, eventually arrive at this moment. Not because it explains everything, nothing explains everything, but because the experience of being cast aside, of being considered worthless, of watching loyalty dissolve overnight, clearly shaped the man in ways that never entirely healed. Holun was extraordinary. This should be said clearly and without qualification. She kept her children alive through sheer force of will and practical intelligence. The family survived by foraging, digging up roots and berries, hunting small animals, fishing in the Onon River. Holun is described in the secret history as going up and down the river, gathering and harvesting, sustaining her children. The image is not glamorous. These were hungry years, years of humiliation and genuine danger. And then came the killing of Begta. Temüjin was around 13 when it happened. The half-brother Begta had apparently been taking food from the younger children, claiming a dominant position in the family hierarchy. In a situation where food meant survival, this was not a trivial offence, but Temüjin and his brother Hasar did not simply confront Begta. They ambushed him, pinned him with arrows, and left him to die. Begta, to his credit, seems to have accepted his fate without begging. The secret history records him as dying with a kind of dignity. This event is deeply uncomfortable to read, and has generated considerable scholarly debate. It was clearly murder. Holun was furious, comparing her sons to wolves and dogs and wild animals. But it also reveals something about Temüjin at 13 that is important. He was not a boy who accepted injustice passively. He was not a boy who waited for someone else to solve his problems. He made decisions and he acted on them, regardless of how those decisions looked to the outside world. This quality would define him for the rest of his life. Sometimes it would make him magnificent, sometimes it would make him monstrous. Often it would be both simultaneously. Shortly after this, the Taichiut clan, apparently deciding that even a penniless Temüjin represented some kind of future threat, came and seized him. This is the clearest sign that his father's blood was taken seriously, even without resources to back it up. They captured him and placed him in a kang, a heavy wooden collar that immobilized the arms and made sleep nearly impossible. He was held as a prisoner, passed from family to family, a humiliating captivity for the son of a chief. He escaped. Of course he escaped. With the help of a compassionate family who hid him, and his own desperate resourcefulness, he got the kang off and fled through the night, hiding in the Onon River up to his neck to avoid detection, while searchers passed nearby. He eventually rejoined his family, and the experience of captivity, of the kangi, of being deliberately humiliated by the Taichiut, went into the long catalogue of grievances and lessons that the young Temüjin carried within him. What comes out of these early years is not a man shaped by privilege or comfort, or the confidence of someone who has always been on the winning side. What comes out is something rarer and in many ways more dangerous. A man who has learned to survive everything. A man who knows exactly how it feels to have nothing. And a man who has decided somewhere in the bones of himself that he will never feel that way again. The making of a leader, alliances, betrayals, and the first followers. By the time Temüjin was in his mid-teens, he was beginning to reassemble a life from its scattered pieces. The family had horses again, enough to sustain themselves. He was growing into physical strength. He had the name of his father, and names on the steppe carried memory even when they carried nothing else. And he had Borte, or rather, he was approaching the age when he could go and claim the betrothal his father had arranged before his death. The journey to retrieve Borte from her father's camp among the Ongirat was more than a romantic errand. It was Temujin's first real political move. Daisechin, Borte's father, could have simply dissolved the betrothal now that Yasuge was dead and his family had nothing. He chose not to. Whether this was loyalty, sentiment, or a calculated bet on the young man's potential is unclear. What is clear is that he gave Temüjin his daughter and a wedding gift of considerable value. The gift was a coat of black sable fur. That sable coat would turn out to matter enormously, and here is where the first great relationship of Temujin's political life comes into focus. To the east and south, there was a man named Togrul, the Khan of the Keret tribe, one of the more powerful leaders on the steppe at that time. Togrul had once been an ally of Temujin's father Yasuge. The relationship between the two men had been close enough that Togrul was considered an anda, a sworn brother. This was a sacred bond on the steppe, more binding in some ways than blood relationship. Temüjin went to Togrul with the sable coat as a gift, and reminded him of the bond he had shared with Yasuge. He asked for Togrul's protection and alliance. Togrul accepted. This was a significant moment. Togrul was not simply being generous. He was a pragmatic man who understood that alliances had value, and that a young man with Temujin's bloodline and evident determination might one day be worth having on his side. From Togrul's perspective, he was acquiring a useful subordinate. From Temujin's perspective, he was acquiring a powerful patron. Neither was entirely right about what they were doing, but that is often how consequential moments work. There was also Jamuka, and Jamuka requires his own careful attention, because he is perhaps the most fascinating figure in the entire story of Genghis Khan's rise, and one of the most tragic. Jamuka had been Temujin's childhood anda, his sworn brother and dearest companion. They had exchanged gifts as boys, the formal pledges of friendship on the steppe, and the bond had been genuine. In their teenage years, after Temujin began to rebuild himself, they renewed that friendship. For a time, they travelled together and camped together, the two of them sharing a blanket, as the secret history rather delicately records. They were young men, friends in the deepest sense, complementing each other. Jamuka was brilliant, witty, learned, and charismatic. He came from a good lineage and had followers of his own. He and Temujin together might have been unstoppable. They were not together for long. The reasons for their eventual split are complex and not entirely clear from the sources. There seems to have been a moment when their camps were travelling together and Jamuka suggested a certain place to stop. Temujin, instead of following, camped somewhere different. This seemingly trivial moment apparently signalled a parting of ways. Hoylan and Borte both interpreted Jamuka's suggestion as containing a subtle insult or power move, and encouraged Temujin to separate. The deeper truth was probably that the two men were too similar in ambition, and too equal in ability to share the same sky indefinitely. The steppe was not big enough for both of them. What followed this separation was the gradual gathering of Temujin's own following. And this is where something important begins to emerge. Other leaders attracted followers through birth and traditional obligation. Temujin attracted followers through something slightly different. He attracted people who had been cast aside, who had been abandoned, who had no other options. Outcasts, former servants, men from broken families. He also attracted followers through a quality that would become one of his defining characteristics. He rewarded loyalty with loyalty. When his people did well, he acknowledged them. When they served him faithfully, he protected them and their families. This sounds simple. On the steppe of the 12th century, it was revolutionary. He also attracted followers through his willingness to rescue people. This is literal, not metaphorical. On multiple occasions, he went to the considerable trouble and risk of recovering people who had been taken, and this gesture of solidarity, in a world where people were frequently left to their own fate, built him an intense personal loyalty among those he saved. And then came the night that everything changed, or rather, the morning. Borte was kidnapped. The Merkits, the tribe from which Hoelun had originally been taken by Yasuge decades earlier, had nursed their grievance across the years and decided to collect on it. They raided Temüjin's camp at dawn, sweeping in before anyone could mount a proper defense. The family scattered. Temüjin escaped into the forest and hid, along with his brothers and several companions. Hoelun escaped. But Borte did not. She was taken, given to a Merkit man as a wife in direct payment for the original insult done to the tribe when Hoelun had been taken years before. Temüjin's reaction to Borte's capture tells you a great deal about him. He did not accept it. He did not move on. He did not seek a political solution or a diplomatic resolution. He went to Tokrul, reminded him of the alliance, and then went to Jamuka, despite the split, because Jamuka had resources and men that Temüjin needed. He assembled a force, and he went and got his wife back. The rescue raid on the Merkit was swift, overwhelming, and completely effective. The Merkit were scattered and Borte was recovered. There is a complication to this story that the sources acknowledge honestly. By the time Borte was recovered, she was pregnant. The child born in the aftermath of her captivity was named Yochi, which means guest. Whether Yochi was Temüjin's son or a Merkit's son was never officially resolved, and the ambiguity would haunt Yochi his entire life and create a fracture in the imperial family that would eventually contribute to the empire's fragmentation. Temüjin accepted Yochi as his son publicly and completely. Whatever doubts may have existed were never spoken aloud by him, at least not on record. This is either a profound act of love or a pragmatic political decision, or most likely both. The rescue of Borte did something else. It demonstrated to the steppe world that Temüjin was a man who fought for what was his, and more than that, it began to draw followers in earnest. After the Merkit campaign, Temüjin's reputation began to grow with a momentum it would never entirely lose. The rise of the Khan unifying the Mongol tribes. The decades between Temüjin's rescue of Borte and the Great Assembly on the banks of the Onon River were not a triumphal march. This is worth saying clearly, because the weight of what came after can make the rise seem inevitable in retrospect, a foregone conclusion dressed up in the language of struggle for narrative effect. It was not inevitable. Not even close. The future Genghis Khan lost battles. He was captured on occasion. He made decisions that nearly ended him, and spent real time in genuine desperation, uncertain whether the next season would bring survival or extinction. The arc of his rise was jagged and violent and deeply uncertain, more like a lightning storm moving across the steppe than a steady sunrise building toward a predetermined noon. The years were a complex blur of campaigns, alliances, betrayals, victories, and catastrophic defeats, each one shaping the man in ways that only became fully visible in what he eventually built. And if you want to understand why the Mongol Empire became what it became, this is the period to study, not the great conquests, not the fall of Zhongdu or the destruction of Samarkand. These hard, obscure, unglamorous decades when Temüjin was learning, failing, recovering, and learning again. The first thing that becomes unmistakably clear during these years is how he learned. When Temüjin lost a battle, which he did not respond in the way that most military leaders of his time responded to defeat. He did not attribute it to bad luck or treachery or the failure of subordinates, though any of these explanations would have been available and culturally acceptable. He analysed it. He looked at what his enemies had done that worked, and he absorbed it, stripped of any attachment to where it had come from or what tradition it belonged to. He had no pride that prevented him from learning from the people who beat him, and in the medieval world this was extraordinarily rare. Most military cultures were deeply resistant to tactical innovation, bound to their methods by prestige and ritual and the institutional inertia of tradition. To change how you fought was, in many contexts, to imply that how your fathers had fought was insufficient, and that kind of implication carried social costs that most leaders were unwilling to pay. Temüjin paid no such costs because he did not recognize them as real. He treated military practice the way a skilled craftsman treats a tool. You use what works, you discard what does not. The origin of the tool is irrelevant to its function. This quality alone would eventually make him the most dangerous military mind of his century, and it was being forged in these uncertain middle years through the experience of losing and surviving and trying again differently. The second thing these years reveal is the nature of his relationship with the men who chose to follow him. The Nukkur, the companions who attached themselves to Temüjin during this period, were not followers in the conventional steppe sense of men who owed tribal allegiance to a chief by virtue of birth and custom. They were men who had chosen him personally, which was a different thing entirely. They came because they believed in him specifically, not in the position he held or the clan he represented, and that personal quality of the bond made it stronger and more durable than conventional obligation. Consider Borchu. As a teenager, when Temüjin's horses were stolen, a young man named Borchu helped him track them down and recover them. A simple act of solidarity that carried real risk and no obvious personal benefit. Borchu then attached himself to Temüjin's fortunes so completely that he remained loyal for decades, through every reversal and uncertainty, because the bond formed in that early moment of help given freely was the kind of bond that did not dissolve when circumstances became difficult. Or consider Gelmay and his younger brother Subutai from the Uriankai people, who would become one of the greatest military commanders in the history of warfare, or Mughali, who would eventually be given effective command of the entire Chinese front and prosecute it with a skill that Genghis Khan trusted completely. These men were not simply soldiers following orders. They were the people Temüjin trusted most completely, and the relationship was personal in a way that later imperial connections, formed at greater scale and across greater distances, could not entirely replicate. He had made them a different kind of promise than the steppe world typically offered. He had told them, through his actions rather than his words, that their loyalty would be met with loyalty, that their service would be remembered and rewarded, that they were not tools to be used and discarded, but companions whose fates were bound to his in ways that ran in both directions. In a world where political loyalty was entirely transactional and could dissolve overnight when a stronger patron appeared, this was remarkable enough to be genuinely attractive. The war with the Tatars was among the most significant conflicts of these middle years, for reasons that were both personal and political and could not be cleanly separated. It was Tatars who had poisoned Yesugei, Temüjin's father, years before. The personal dimension of the conflict was therefore real and acknowledged. But the Tatars were also a major political force on the steppe, a recurring source of instability and violence, and their continued independence was a structural problem for anyone seeking to unify the Mongolian world. With the support of his patron Tohrul, Temüjin defeated the Tatars decisively in the early 1200s. What he did next startled his allies and clarified something essential about the kind of leader he was becoming. He ordered the systematic killing of all Tatar men taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel. The measurement is specific and was apparently applied literally, giving the command a procedural quality that made it feel more like policy than passion. Every adult male was killed. Women and children were absorbed into the Mongol Confederation, distributed among families, integrated into the expanding community of people who are now Temüjin's people, regardless of what they had previously been. This was not simply vengeance, though vengeance was certainly present in it, and Temüjin would not have denied that. It was a political calculation of cold precision. Eliminating the adult male population of a defeated enemy tribe removed its capacity for future rebellion, while absorbing the women and children increased his own numbers without creating a permanent internal threat. The Tatars ceased to exist as a political entity. Their people continued, folded into something larger, their tribal identity dissolved by design. The conflict with Jamuka was always going to happen. By the late 1200s, the two former sworn brothers had become the poles of a fundamental division in the Mongolian world, each drawing followers from among the steppe tribes according to a logic that was deeper than personal rivalry. Jamuka attracted men who valued the traditional social order, the established aristocracy of birth and lineage and inherited privilege. Temüjin attracted men who valued ability over birth, who had found that the traditional order had nothing to offer them, and who were therefore willing to try something different. This was not an ideological divide in the conscious modern sense. Neither man would have framed it in those terms, but the practical effect was that they were building two different versions of what the steppe world could be, and only one version was going to survive. They fought, and in the first major battle between them, at a place called Dalan Baljut, Jamuka won. He won comprehensively, defeating Temüjin's forces in a way that left little room for ambiguity about the outcome. To press his advantage and to demonstrate to the steppe world the cost of opposing him, Jamuka reportedly had 70 young men captured from Temüjin's side boiled alive in cauldrons. It was an act of deliberate theatrical brutality, and in the immediate term it worked. It communicated power and the willingness to use it without hesitation or mercy. But something interesting happened in the longer term. People drifted toward Temüjin rather than away from him, not immediately and not in a rush, but steadily, over the following years, The brutality that Jamuka had deployed as a demonstration of strength began to work against him, because people compared it to what Temüjin offered and found the comparison unfavourable to Jamuka. Temüjin's men were not simply instruments of his ambition. He had made them something closer to partners, and that difference mattered to people who were trying to decide which future to attach themselves to. The gathering on the banks of the Onon River in 1206 was the culmination of everything these years had built toward. By this point, Temüjin had defeated or absorbed the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, and the Kerites. His old patron Tokhrul had eventually turned against him, because that was the nature of the steppe world, and Temüjin had defeated the Karaite Khan decisively, sending the old man to his death among the Naimans who wanted no part of harbouring a liability, and Jamuka, brilliant and tragic Jamuka, had finally been betrayed by his own followers, men who handed him to Temüjin hoping for reward. What Temüjin did next tells you something essential about the kind of man he was. He had the men who had betrayed their own Khan executed. Not Jamuka, the men who had handed him over. Because betraying your own leader, regardless of circumstances, regardless of who that leader was or what cause the betrayal served, was a crime that Temüjin found genuinely unforgivable. A man who would betray one master would betray another. There was no version of such a man that he wanted in his service or in his world. And then he offered Jamuka his life. He asked his old friend, his childhood sworn brother, the man who had defeated him at Dahlan Balzut, and who had spent years as his most dangerous rival, to become his companion again, to return to what they had been when they were young men sharing a blanket by a fire on the steppe, before ambition had made enemies of them. The secret history preserves Jamuka's refusal as one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire chronicle. He had been too proud for too long, too independent, too much his own man to become anyone's subordinate now, even the subordinate of the man who was about to rule the world. He asked instead for a death without bloodshed, the honourable death of a chief. Temüjin granted it. At the Kurultai of 1206, on the banks of the Onon River where Temüjin had been born, the assembled leaders of the Mongolian steppe recognised him as the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of all the Mongol peoples. The shaman Teb Tengri declared that heaven had commanded it. A white banner with 9 tails was raised against the sky. The name given to him in that moment was Genghis Khan. Its precise meaning remains debated by scholars. Universal ruler, oceanic ruler, authority without limit or horizon. Whatever the exact translation, the intent was unmistakable. This man was no longer one chief among many, competing for followers on the endless grass. He was the ruler of all of it. The world at that moment had absolutely no idea what that meant, but it was about to find out. A new kind of army. How Genghis Khan built the most fearsome war machine in history. Here is a question that historians have been asking for 800 years. How did a group of nomadic herders from one of the most sparsely populated regions on Earth conquer more territory in a single generation than the Roman Empire acquired in several centuries? The answer is not as simple as many people assume. It is not simply that the Mongols were more violent than everyone else, or luckier, or that their enemies were unusually weak. The answer lies in what Genghis Khan built after 1206, and what he built was something that the world of his time had never encountered and was completely unprepared to face. He built a new kind of army. The first and most fundamental reform was the dismantling of the tribal unit as the basis of military organisation. In the traditional steppe military system, men fought alongside their tribal kinsmen, under the leadership of their tribal chief. This meant that tribal loyalty competed with military loyalty, and tribal chiefs had private armies that answered to them personally rather than to the Khan. This was a recipe for fragmentation, betrayal, and limited cohesion. Genghis Khan abolished it. He reorganized the entire army on the decimal system. Men were grouped into units of 10 called an arban. 10 arbans made a J-gun of 100. 10 yaguns made a mingan of 1,000. 10 mingans made a 2-men of 10,000. Every man belonged to a specific unit, and the units were deliberately mixed across tribal lines, breaking up old kinship groups and creating new loyalties based on military service rather than blood. This sounds like an administrative reform. It was also a political masterstroke. A tribesman whose unit contained men from 5 different former tribes did not have a tribal structure to retreat into. His world was his unit, his commander and the army. His identity was Mongol, not Tatar or Merkit or Karaite. The commanders of these units, at every level, were appointed by Genghis Khan on the basis of demonstrated ability and loyalty, not on the basis of birth. This was a radical departure from steppe tradition. A man of humble origins could command 1,000 soldiers if he had proven himself capable. An aristocrat who failed in command would be replaced. The meritocracy was not perfect, and it was not absolute, but it was real enough to produce a core of military leaders of extraordinary quality. Discipline was absolute, and when I say absolute, I mean absolute. If one man in an arban of 10 deserted in battle, all 10 were executed. If one jargon broke and fled, the entire 100 could be put to death. This was deliberately extreme because it served a specific purpose. It eliminated the rational choice of retreat. In most armies of the medieval world, when a battle seemed lost, the calculation that an individual soldier made was simple. Do I stay and risk death, or do I run and live? For Mongol soldiers, flight meant certain execution by their own side, so the rational choice was to keep fighting. This transformed the army's battlefield behavior in ways that enemies found deeply disturbing. Mongol units simply did not break and run in the way that other armies did, even under severe pressure. The logistics system was equally impressive. The Mongol army travelled with extraordinary speed, covering distances that contemporary armies could not match, and that contemporary observers found almost literally unbelievable. Part of this was the horse system. Every Mongol soldier rode with multiple remounts, typically 3 to 5 horses per man. They could ride all day, switch horses and keep moving, covering distances of up to 80 or even 100 miles in a single day when conditions allowed. The army did not drag a long supply train behind it. It lived off the land, supplemented by carefully maintained herds that moved with the army. This gave it a mobility that was genuinely unprecedented. The tactics the Mongols employed on the battlefield were complex, flexible, and thoroughly rehearsed. The feigned retreat was perhaps the most famous. Mongol units would advance, make contact, and then break away as if fleeing in panic. Pursuing enemies, convinced they had won, would give chase and find themselves suddenly engulfed as the retreating units curved back and units that had been waiting in concealment closed in from the flanks and rear. This maneuver, the Tulukhma, was not improvised. It was drilled to perfection and executed with a precision that required enormous discipline and trust in the commanders. Genghis Khan also understood psychological warfare with a sophistication that was far ahead of his time. The Mongol reputation for utter, total destruction of anyone who resisted, combined with merciful treatment of those who surrendered immediately and peacefully, was not accidental. It was a deliberate policy. If a city opened its gates without a fight, it would be spared, its people would be allowed to live, and its administration would be absorbed into the Mongol system. If a city resisted, it would be taken eventually, because the Mongol army could besiege as well as raid. And when it was taken, the consequences would be absolute. Word of this policy spread ahead of the armies. Many cities that might have resisted simply did not, because the rational calculation was obvious. The fear the Mongols deliberately cultivated was itself a military weapon, reducing the strength of the resistance they would face. The army also absorbed and used technology from conquered peoples with a pragmatism that was characteristic of everything Genghis Khan did. When they encountered Chinese siege technology, the trebuchets and catapults and flame weapons that the steppe nomads had never needed before, they hired the engineers and incorporated the machines into their army. The Mongol army that took on the walled cities of China and Central Asia was genuinely different from the army that had united the steppe, because it had added capabilities while keeping everything that had already worked. It was a learning organization in a world of static ones. The intelligence system was also remarkable. Before a Mongol army invaded a region, Mongol agents, often traveling as merchants, had already been there. They had assessed the strength of the defenses, the loyalty of the population, the political divisions among the rulers, the locations of food and water sources. Genghis Khan did not attack blind. He attacked with information, and the combination of information, speed, deception, and overwhelming violence when violence was required made his army almost impossible to defend against, using the military systems available in the 12th and 13th centuries. What Genghis Khan built, in short, was not just a powerful army. It was a revolutionary military system, a system that would remain essentially undefeated for most of a century and would reshape the political geography of the known world. The first conquests, Xixia and the Jin dynasty. The great Khan sat on the banks of the Onon River in 1206, master of all the Mongolian steppe, and he looked south, toward the world beyond the grass. To the south lay two major powers that had long treated the steppe peoples with a combination of contempt and cautious management that settled civilizations typically extended to their nomadic neighbors. The first was the Western Xia Kingdom, known in Chinese as Xixia, a state ruled by the Tangut people in what is now northwestern China. The second, and vastly more powerful, was the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China proper and was the main political descendant of the Yuetian people, who had themselves once been nomadic conquerors. The Jin dynasty is particularly important to understand because it had been the steppe's southern neighbour and occasional overlord for generations. The Jin had played the various Mongolian tribes against each other for decades, deliberately fostering division to prevent the formation of exactly the kind of unified steppe confederation that Genghis Khan had just created. They had even sent forces to kill promising Mongol leaders when such leaders appeared to be growing too powerful. They had, in short, contributed to the conditions that had shaped Genghis Khan's childhood, and he had not forgotten it. But he was smart enough not to go after the Jin first. The Jin were enormous, wealthy, populous, and possessed considerable military power. They had millions of soldiers, vast fortified cities, and resources that dwarfed anything on the steppe. A direct frontal assault in 1206 would have been suicidal, even for the newly unified Mongol army. So Genghis Khan started with the smaller target. The Western Xia were not exactly pushovers. They controlled important trade routes, had a military of their own, and had been a regional power for over 2 centuries. But they were smaller than the Jin, less defensible, and geographically positioned in a way that made them more accessible. And importantly, they owed tribute to the Jin dynasty, which made attacking them a subtle message directed at the larger power as much as an actual strategic objective. The first Mongol campaigns against the Western Xia began around 1205 and 1209. These early raids were not full invasions so much as probing operations, testing defences, learning the terrain, and demonstrating Mongol capabilities. What Temüjin's forces encountered were walled cities, and this was genuinely novel. The Mongol army was extraordinary in open-field combat. Siege warfare was something else, something that required different tools and different thinking. The Mongols adapted. Slowly at first and with difficulty, but they adapted. They learned to cut off water supplies. They learned to destroy crops and starve garrisons. They learned to dam rivers and divert them to flood fortifications. They learned to use artillery, however rudimentary their initial versions were, to throw projectiles over city walls. And they brought in people who knew more than they did about these things, which was perhaps the most important adaptation of all. In 1209, Genghis Khan launched a full-scale invasion of the Western Xia. The campaign demonstrated both the army's extraordinary strengths and its current limitations. The Mongols could devastate the countryside and defeat the Xia in open battle with ease, but the capital city of Zhongxing held out even when Genghis Khan attempted to dam the Yellow River and flood it. The dam broke, flooding the Mongol camp instead, which is exactly the kind of thing that happens when you try to move the Yellow River and the river disagrees. The Tangut ruler agreed to terms. He would become a vassal of the Mongol Khan, pay tribute, supply troops, and acknowledge Mongol supremacy. He did not follow through entirely on these promises, but for the moment the Mongols had achieved their primary objectives. The knowledge gained in this campaign was more valuable than the tribute extracted. Genghis Khan understood now what it would take to attack walled cities, and he went about acquiring that capability methodically. The attack on the Jin dynasty began in 1211, and it was a different kind of war entirely. The Jin controlled the world's largest agricultural civilization, a society of tens of millions supported by sophisticated bureaucracy, professional armies, and infrastructure that had been built over centuries. Their northern border was protected by significant fortifications, including stretches of wall that were the predecessors of what we now call the Great Wall of China. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Mongol approach to the Jin campaign was not to try to conquer everything at once. It was to destabilize, to destroy, to loot on a massive scale, to defeat any field armies that came out to fight, and to demonstrate that the Jin could not protect their own people. The Mongols swept through the Jin countryside like a natural disaster, stripping it of resources, defeating armies, capturing officials, and accumulating an enormous quantity of human capital in the form of skilled craftsmen, engineers, administrators, and scholars who would serve Genghis Khan in the decades to come. The Jin attempted several counteroffensives. They failed. The Mongol cavalry was simply too fast, too cohesive, and too disciplined for the Jin army, which relied heavily on infantry. Time and again, Jin commanders tried to bring the Mongols to a decisive pitched battle, and found themselves either outmaneuvered or overwhelmed. By 1215, the Mongol forces had swept across northern China repeatedly, devastating the countryside and making it clear that the Jin dynasty could not stop them. The Jin capital, Zhongdu, was besieged. The Jin emperor made the strategic mistake of attempting to abandon Zhongdu and move the capital south to Kaifeng, and the Mongols exploited this moment of weakness to capture Zhongdu in 1215. The fall of Zhongdu yielded an almost unimaginable quantity of wealth: silk, gold, and silver, thousands of craftsmen and scholars, siege engineers who could teach the Mongol army the mechanics of Chinese siege warfare in detail. The looting of Zhongdu was reported to have lasted for a month. The fires burned for so long that the ground around the city was said to be greasy with human fat for months afterward. This is a horrible detail. It is also, unfortunately, probably accurate. The Jin campaign was not yet complete. The Jin still controlled much of northern China from their new capital, but the damage done was irreversible, and the knowledge gained was even more valuable than the plunder. Genghis Khan now had Chinese siege engineers, Chinese administrators experienced in governing settled populations, and an army that had learned, at considerable cost and effort, how to take walled cities. He was going to need that knowledge very soon. The Silk Road and the Khwarezmian Empire, the deadliest provocation. There is a moment in the story of Genghis Khan that pivots everything, a moment when the destruction that followed was not necessary, not inevitable, and was instead the direct consequence of choices made by other people, who, had they thought more carefully, might have lived to regret their decisions rather than simply not living at all. That moment involved a trade caravan, a governor with poor judgment, and a Shah who made the worst diplomatic decision of the 13th century. The Khwarezmian Empire in 1218 was one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. It stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the borders of India to the borders of the Abbasid Caliphate. Shah Muhammad II ruled this enormous realm from his capital, and he had recently expanded it dramatically, overthrowing the Kara-Khitan Khanate and consolidating control over Central Asia. He was powerful, wealthy, and, as events would demonstrate, somewhat overestimating of his own security. Genghis Khan at this point was not particularly interested in conquering the Khwarezmian Empire. This is important to understand. He had enough on his hands with the Jin campaign in China. What he was interested in was trade. The Silk Road ran through Khwarezmian territory, and control of that trade was enormously valuable. He sent a caravan to Khwarezm, reportedly 500 men and a large quantity of goods, with the intention of establishing commercial relations. Shah Muhammad had the caravan seized and the merchants executed, on the orders of the governor of the border city of Otrar. The governor, a man named Inalchuk, appears to have suspected the merchants of being spies, which some of them possibly were, and decided to seize their goods and kill them, rather than deal with the diplomatic complications. He reported to the Shah that the caravan had been carrying spies. The Shah accepted this explanation, or chose to accept it, and when Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic envoy to demand explanation and restitution, the Shah had the envoy executed and sent the heads of the accompanying merchants back to the Mongol court. The execution of an ambassador was, in Mongol law and custom, among the most serious violations possible. Ambassadors were sacred. They travelled under a protection that was absolute. To kill an ambassador was not an insult. It was a declaration of war of the most unambiguous kind, and even then Genghis Khan paused. The sources suggest he went alone into the mountains and prayed to his sky god Tengri for days before returning with his decision. Whether this was genuine spiritual consultation, or simply the great Khan taking the time to think clearly about the most consequential decision of his reign, is impossible to say from the outside. Probably both. He was 50 years old or thereabouts. He had a successful empire. He did not need another war on another front while the Jin campaign was still ongoing. But the killing of his ambassador left him, within his own framework of values, no choice. An insult of this magnitude left unanswered would signal weakness. And on the steppe, weakness was invitation. He gathered his army. He requested information from every source available. He consulted his generals. He moved the Jin campaign to a subordinate status, and in 1219, the largest Mongol army ever assembled, estimates range from 150,000 to 200,000 men, moved westward toward the Khwarezmian Empire. Shah Muhammad had perhaps 400,000 soldiers at his disposal. On paper, the numbers favoured him. In reality, he was already in serious trouble and probably didn't fully know it. His army was not the unified force it appeared. It was composed of disparate groups with different loyalties, different commanders, and no common culture of discipline or sacrifice comparable to what the Mongols had developed. The Shah himself was not a beloved or inspiring figure to many of his troops, and his strategic response to the Mongol invasion revealed a fundamental failure of imagination. He dispersed his forces to defend his cities rather than concentrating them for a field battle. This meant that when the Mongols arrived, they did not face a single massive army. They faced a series of isolated garrisons that could not support each other and could be picked off one by one. But before the destruction, there was one more act in the drama of approach. Genghis Khan sent a final message. Surrender and live, with your people intact and your lives preserved, or fight and lose everything. The Shah did not surrender. The wrath unleashed. The destruction of Khwarizm. What happened to the Khwarezmian Empire between 1219 and 1221 is one of the most devastating events in the recorded history of human civilization. This is not an exaggeration. Contemporary sources, both Mongol and non-Mongol, describe what occurred in language that still conveys shock across 8 centuries. Cities that had stood for hundreds of years and housed hundreds of thousands of people were reduced to rubble and bone in days. The scale of the destruction was so complete and so rapid that it seemed to contemporaries like the work of something inhuman. The Mongol army moved on multiple axes simultaneously, something that required extraordinary coordination over vast distances. One force under Genghis Khan's sons Jochi, Chagatai and Ogedi marched toward the city of Otrar, where the governor who had murdered the caravan waited behind his walls. Another force advanced toward other targets, and Genghis Khan himself, with Subutai and Jibi and the best cavalry, performed one of the most spectacular maneuvers in military history. The Kizilkum Desert lay between the Mongol approach and the city of Bukhara. The desert was considered impassable by armies. It was certainly not a route that a sensible military commander would have chosen for the movement of a large force, which is precisely why the Shah had not defended it. His intelligence suggested that no army could cross the Kizilkum, so when Genghis Khan appeared suddenly before the walls of Bukhara, after crossing the supposedly impassable desert, the city's defenders and population were not simply surprised. They were psychologically devastated. If the Mongols could come from that direction, then there was no direction from which they could not come. Defense became a matter of waiting rather than a matter of fighting. Bukhara was one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of scholarship, of art, of commerce and theology. It had perhaps 100,000 inhabitants. It had massive walls and a substantial garrison. It was, by any reasonable measure, a city that should have been capable of significant resistance. It fell in days. Some of the garrison managed to break out through the Mongol lines. Those who remained surrendered. Genghis Khan entered the city and is reported in one of the most famous accounts of the whole campaign to have ridden into the great mosque and addressed the assembled population from the pulpit. He told them that he was the punishment of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him. This story may be apocryphal. It may be a later embellishment by Islamic historians trying to make theological sense of what had happened, but it has the ring of something the man might actually have said, because it reflects a characteristic of his thinking that is documented elsewhere. He believed that Tengri, the sky god, had given him the world, that his victories were divinely mandated, that resistance to him was, in some sense, resistance to heaven itself. The city was stripped of its valuables. Those citizens with useful skills were taken for service. The remainder of the population was driven out as the city was given over to fire. The great buildings of Bukhara, the mosques and madrasas and markets burned for days. Then came Samarkand. Samarkand was the greatest city of Central Asia, perhaps the greatest city in the Eastern Islamic world. It was the capital, effectively, of the Khwarezmian Empire's cultural and political life. Its walls were enormously strong, its garrison was substantial, its population was vast. Defenders assumed it could hold for months, possibly years. It held for days. When the Mongols appeared before Samarkand in force from multiple directions, the psychological impact was enough to shatter whatever organized resistance might have been possible. The garrison attempted a sortie and was destroyed. The city's population and remaining soldiers then simply surrendered. Genghis Khan accepted the surrender and kept the peace he had offered. Those who submitted peacefully were largely not harmed. The garrison soldiers who had fought were killed. The artisans and craftsmen were sorted out from the population and sent east to work for the Mongol Empire. The city's most valuable goods were taken, and then the city was allowed to continue existing. though a shadow of what it had been. The governor of Otrar, the man who had started all of this by killing the trade caravan, did not survive. The city fell after a long siege, the governor having apparently tried to hold out long after everyone else had seen which way things were going. He was captured and executed. According to some accounts, molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, both as punishment and as a kind of dark joke about the greed that had led him to seize the caravan's goods. This story may also be embellishment, but again, it has the ring of a Mongol sense of justice. The Shah himself fled. He fled westward, always staying ahead of the Mongol forces that were sent specifically to pursue and capture him. Genghis Khan assigned two of his best commanders, Jebe and Subutai, to this pursuit, a mission that would turn into one of the most extraordinary cavalry raids in military history. The Shah was never captured. He died on a small island in the Caspian Sea in 1220, of illness or despair or both, his empire already gone, his son trying to organise what resistance remained. The son, Jalal ad-Din, was made of different material than his father, and proved to be a far more dangerous opponent. He assembled forces, fought back against the Mongols in several engagements, and won at least one significant battle that caused Genghis Khan genuine surprise. The Battle of Parwan in 1221 was a real Mongol defeat. Genghis Khan responded by personally leading a force to deal with the problem. Jalal ad-Din retreated and attempted to cross the Indus River to seek refuge in India, and the Mongols caught him at the river's edge. Cornered, with the river behind him and the Mongol army in front, he did something remarkable. He drove his horse into the river and swam across under Mongol arrow fire, escaping with a handful of followers. Genghis Khan reportedly watched from the bank and expressed admiration. The son had been more worthy of his father's throne than his father had been, but the Khwarezmian Empire was finished. In the space of 2 years, one of the great empires of the medieval world had been swept away. Cities that had existed for centuries were now ruins. Population centres that had housed hundreds of thousands were emptied. The agricultural systems that had sustained the region, the khanats and irrigation networks built over generations, were destroyed, in some cases permanently. The demographic and environmental impact of the Mongol invasion of Khwarezm was so severe that some regions did not fully recover for centuries. When subsequent travellers crossed what had been the heartland of the Khwarezmian Empire, they described landscapes of bones and abandoned cities, the grass growing through the ruins of libraries and mosques, the silence where there had once been the noise of one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. It is worth pausing here in this vast and devastating chapter to note something that the pure narrative of conquest sometimes obscures. The people who died in these cities were not abstractions. They were scholars who had memorized the entire works of Ibn Sina. They were merchants who had travelled the Silk Road and knew the prices in every market from China to Cairo. They were mothers and fathers and children and grandparents. They were artists and musicians and theologians and farmers. They were the human substance of a civilization that had been building itself for centuries, and they were gone. Not all of them. Enough survived for civilization in the region to eventually rebuild. But the loss was real and immense and almost incomprehensible in its totality. Genghis Khan was, by 1221, around 60 years old. He had just overseen the most destructive military campaign in the history of the world to that point, and he was still going. The generals who shaped the world, Subutai, Jebe, and the Western Raid, while Genghis Khan dealt with the remnants of the Khwarezmian resistance and the troublesome Jalal ad-Din, he had already sent his two most extraordinary generals on a mission that began as a pursuit and turned into something that no one, possibly including Genghis Khan himself, could have fully anticipated: Jebe and Subutai. These two men deserve their own chapter, and they are getting one, because what they accomplished in 1219 to 1223 was so spectacular that military historians still study it as one of the greatest strategic operations in the history of warfare. In fact, if you are studying military history at a serious level, and you have not encountered the Western campaign of Jebe and Subutai, you have a gap. Fix it. Jebe had originally been an enemy. He was a Mongolian warrior who had shot Genghis Khan's horse from under him in battle before the unification of the tribes. After the battle, Genghis Khan summoned him and asked directly if it was he who had shot the horse. Jebe admitted it. Genghis Khan, rather than executing him, said that here was a man honest enough to admit a thing that could have gotten him killed. He made him a commander. This anecdote may be embellished, but reflects something true about how Genghis Khan recruited. Honest ability was worth more to him than comfortable deference. Subutai was the son of a blacksmith, which in steppe terms was an honourable but not aristocratic origin. He had attached himself to Genghis Khan as a young man, and demonstrated a genius for military thinking that was, even among the extraordinary commanders of the Mongol army, exceptional. He fought in almost every major Mongol campaign for 3 decades. He would later command the western invasion of Europe in 1241, at which point he was in his 60s and had already travelled farther on military campaigns than any general in history before him. Subutai is probably the most underappreciated military genius in world history, at least in Western historiography, simply because most of his career was spent fighting people who were not European, and who therefore did not write the history that European and American scholars subsequently read and taught. The mission of Jebi and Subutai began as a pursuit of Shah Muhammad. They chased him around the Caspian Sea, across northern Iran, through Azerbaijan, and into the Caucasus. When the Shah died on his island and the pursuit mission was technically complete, they had travelled so far and found themselves in such interesting territory that they continued. What were they going to do? Just turn around and go home? In the Caucasus, they encountered the Kingdom of Georgia, whose ruler at the time was the formidable Queen Rusudan, inheritor of a powerful Christian kingdom that had been expanding its own influence in the region for decades. The Georgians were experienced fighters with an impressive military tradition. They engaged the Mongols, they lost. The Georgians were defeated in 1220, though they were not destroyed, and the Mongols continued north. Through the Caucasus passes they came, into the steppe north of the Black Sea and the Caspian, the territory of the Cuman people. The Cumans were a powerful steppe confederation with their own cavalry traditions and their own wars. They were also, crucially, connected by family ties to the Russian princes to their north. The Mongols approached the Cumans with a proposition. We are steppe people, like you. We share this world. Help us against our enemies and we will leave you in peace. Then, after the Cumans tentatively agreed, the Mongols turned and attacked a combined force of Cumans and Alans, demonstrating that their promises of peace were conditional on there being nobody worth fighting. The Cumans fled north, appealing to the Russian princes for help against this new eastern threat. Here is where it gets particularly interesting. The Russian princes of the early 13th century were numerous, politically fragmented, and not always on the best terms with each other, but the threat from the east was alarming enough that they agreed to a joint campaign. A coalition of Russian princes and Cuman warriors, a significant force, moved south to meet the Mongols in 1223. The Battle of the Kalka River was one of those encounters that seems, from the Russian perspective, to have started well and ended catastrophically in ways that were very difficult to explain afterward. The Mongol forces employed their characteristic feigned retreat, drawing the Russian and Cuman force forward in apparent pursuit of a fleeing enemy. The Cumans broke first, turning and riding away when the Mongols turned back to fight. This unravelled the coalition, and the Mongol forces were able to defeat the Russian princes in detail, killing many of them in the process. After the battle, surviving Russian princes were taken captive. The Mongols killed them without drawing blood, which was the honourable steppe death reserved for men of standing. They laid boards over the bound captives and sat on them at a celebratory feast. Suffocation rather than stabbing or decapitation. This seemed, to Russian chroniclers recording the event afterward, both practical and deeply horrifying. The Rus princes had been defeated, and the first Mongol reconnaissance of Europe, for that is what this effectively was, had revealed valuable information. The Russian principalities were fragmented. The Cumans were unreliable allies. The military systems of the Rus were no match for the Mongol combined arms approach. All of this would be remembered and used 17 years later when Batu Khan and Subutai returned for the actual invasion. But in 1223, Jebi and Subutai turned east and rode home. The entire circuit from the Caspian Sea around through the Caucasus, across the Pontic steppe, into Russia and back, covered something approaching 5,000 miles of hostile territory. They had done it in roughly 2 years, with a force that never exceeded 30,000 men, and had fought and defeated armies in Georgia, Armenia, the North Caucasus, among the Cumans, and finally the Rus princes. It remains, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary strategic operations in the history of warfare. Jebi died on the return journey, probably of illness. Subutai lived to keep going and going and going, because Subutai was simply built differently from other human beings. Genghis Khan and the gods, religion, shamanism, and spiritual power. For all his military genius, his organizational brilliance, and his capacity for violence so total and so efficiently deployed that it reshaped the physical geography of continents, Genghis Khan was a deeply spiritual man, I want to pause on that sentence for a moment, because it tends to produce a kind of cognitive dissonance in people encountering this story for the first time. We are accustomed to thinking of ruthless conquerors as essentially cynical, men who use the language of divine sanction as a political tool while privately believing in nothing beyond their own ambition. That model does not fit Genghis Khan, or at least the evidence does not support it. The spiritual and the practical were not separate categories in his worldview. They were not two different rooms in the same house that he moved between depending on the occasion. They were the same room. Heaven had chosen him. Heaven guided him. The evidence of heaven's favour was written in his victories, in the improbable trajectory of a life that had begun in poverty and captivity and ended in the rule of the largest empire ever assembled. The logic was circular, yes. It was also, for the man who lived inside it, completely and utterly self-reinforcing. Every victory confirmed the mandate. Every survival of impossible odds deepened the conviction. By the time he was old enough to reflect on his life, the pattern was so consistent and so extreme that it would have been difficult for any reasonable person in his position not to conclude that something extraordinary was at work. The traditional religion of the Mongolian steppe was shamanism, and at the centre of that tradition stood Tengri, the eternal blue sky, the supreme governing force of the universe as the steppe peoples understood it. Tengri was not a personal god in the way that the Abrahamic traditions conceived of their deity. There was no covenant, no scripture, no prophetic tradition, no congregation. Tengri was more like a vast impersonal cosmic order, the sky itself made divine, the force that governed the fate of peoples and individuals according to principles that were real and consistent, even when they were not fully comprehensible. To receive Tengri's favour was the highest possible form of blessing. It meant that the universe was on your side, not in the small domestic sense of personal fortune, but in the largest possible sense of cosmic alignment. Your victories were not merely yours. They were heaven's intention made visible in the world. Genghis Khan believed this with what every available source suggests was total sincerity. Not performed sincerity, not the sincerity of a man who knows his people need a god to fight for and provides one accordingly, but the sincerity of genuine conviction. He prayed alone on mountains before campaigns. He credited Tengri explicitly and repeatedly for his victories in ways that go beyond formula. He consulted the divine before major decisions with an earnestness that his commanders took seriously because he clearly did. The relationship between the Khan and the sky god was mediated, as all shamanic relationships were, by specialists. Shamans, men and women who possessed the ability to move between the human world and the spirit world, served as interpreters of divine intention, conductors of ritual, and readers of the signs that Tengri and the other spirits of the steppe world scattered across the natural landscape for those skilled enough to read them. The most important shaman in Genghis Khan's life, certainly in the early decades of his rule, was a remarkable and ultimately tragic figure named Tengri. The name translates roughly as he who speaks with heaven, and for a while he seemed to justify it. He had been present at the Great Kurultai of 1206, the assembly on the banks of the Onon River, where the Mongol world gathered to recognize Temüjin as Genghis Khan. It was Tengri who stood before the assembly and declared that heaven had commanded this, that Tengri himself had mandated the rule of this man over all peoples living under the eternal blue sky. The political effect of that declaration, in a world that took such things with complete seriousness, was enormous. It gave the new Khan a legitimacy that extended beyond military victory into the cosmic order itself. For a time, the relationship between the Khan and his shaman was one of genuine mutual benefit. Tengri provided spiritual authority, Genghis Khan provided protection and political power. The arrangement worked because both men understood their roles and kept to them. Then Tengri began to expand his role. The precise sequence of events that led to the falling out is somewhat murky in the sources, as things involving shamanic politics in the early 13th century tend to be. What is clear is that Tengri began making claims that went beyond spiritual interpretation into political territory. He apparently suggested at various points that the divine favour supporting the Khan was not permanently fixed, that it was conditional, that it could potentially be withdrawn or in some sense transferred. He gathered followers of his own, accumulating a personal power base that operated somewhat independently of the Khan's authority. He interfered in disputes involving the Khan's own family members in ways that Genghis Khan found, at minimum, intolerable. The resolution was swift and characteristically decisive. Genghis Khan arranged for his brothers to provoke a physical confrontation with the shaman, and in that confrontation Tengri's spine was broken, which was the traditional Mongol method of executing someone of spiritual standing, a death that shed no blood and was therefore considered appropriately respectful of the sacred nature of the person being killed. Genghis Khan then explained the death in terms that were perfectly consistent with his spiritual framework. Tengri had overreached. He had become arrogant. He had, in claiming power beyond what was rightfully his, angered Tengri himself. Heaven had therefore withdrawn its favour from the shaman, and this was why he had died. The episode is, if you think about it, a masterclass in political theology. Genghis Khan had eliminated a rival power centre while simultaneously reinforcing his own divine mandate. The message to everyone watching was clear. Even the man who speaks with heaven has limits, and those limits are defined by the Khan. The spiritual and the political had been separated in this moment only to demonstrate that they could not, in the end, ever truly be separated. This dynamic, genuine belief coexisting with complete unwillingness to allow any religious authority to challenge political control defined Genghis Khan's relationship with religion for the rest of his life, and it produced something that was, in the broader context of the medieval world, genuinely extraordinary. He was tolerant. Radically, systematically, institutionally tolerant of other people's religious beliefs and practices, in a way that was almost entirely without precedent among rulers of comparable power in the 12th and 13th centuries. Christians of various denominations, Muslims of both major traditions, Buddhists, Confucians, Taoists, animists, Nestorians, and practitioners of local shamanistic traditions from a dozen different cultural backgrounds all found a place within the Mongol Empire. They were not merely tolerated in the sense of being allowed to exist quietly and keep their heads down. They were actively protected. Clergy of all faiths were formally exempted from taxation, a provision that appears to have been a genuine policy rather than an occasional favour. Theological thinkers and religious scholars were welcomed at the Mongol court and engaged with a curiosity that contemporaries found somewhat disorienting. Genghis Khan sent his sons to be educated under the influence of different religious traditions, which is an extraordinary thing for a ruler of any era to do, let alone one operating in the early 13th century when religious uniformity was considered so obviously necessary for social cohesion that questioning it would have seemed like questioning whether the sun should rise. The pragmatic basis for this tolerance is not hard to identify. An empire that contained millions of devout Muslims in Central Asia, tens of millions of Chinese people, whose spiritual lives were shaped by a complex interweaving of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, and significant Christian populations in Georgia, Armenia, and throughout the Nestorian communities of the Silk Road corridor, could not realistically be governed through religious uniformity. Even if Genghis Khan had wanted to impose a single faith, which there is no evidence he did, the practical impossibility of it would have been obvious. The choice was between tolerance and perpetual religious civil war, and the man who had unified the Mongol steppe by understanding which fights were worth having had no difficulty identifying the right answer. But the sources suggest something that goes beyond pure calculation. He was genuinely curious. He asked questions of religious leaders that were too specific, too probing, too philosophically engaged to be purely diplomatic performance. A Taoist master named Changchun travelled thousands of miles to meet him at his camp in Central Asia around 1222, and the conversations between them were apparently substantive enough that Changchun's disciple wrote a detailed account of the journey and the discussions. Genghis Khan questioned the Taoist about the nature of the divine, about the principles of health and long life, about the Taoist understanding of the relationship between the individual and the cosmos. He reportedly told Changchun at some point that he found wisdom in the teachings of every tradition he had encountered. That is either the most sophisticated thing a medieval conqueror ever said, or it is remarkably sophisticated diplomacy, or it is both simultaneously, which is probably the correct answer for a man who consistently managed to be both things at once. The shamanic dimensions of his spiritual life persisted alongside all of this intellectual curiosity. Before major campaigns, rituals were performed. Shamans read the future in the cracked shoulder blades of sheep heated over fire, a practice of scapulomancy that the Mongols shared with numerous other Eurasian cultures. Sacrifices were made, omens were observed and interpreted, stars were watched for meaning. Dreams were taken seriously, including and especially Genghis Khan's own dreams, which he understood as direct communications from Tengri, and which he described to his commanders and advisors with an expectation that they would be taken seriously. They were. The result of all of this, the shamanic foundation, The genuine philosophical curiosity, the strategic tolerance, and the consistent insistence that no religious authority would ever hold political power over him, was an empire that practiced something recognizable as freedom of religion roughly 2 centuries before the concept had a name in Western political thought. The Islamic world the Mongols devastated in Central Asia was, in this specific respect, less religiously pluralistic than the people who devastated it. The Christian kingdoms of Europe that the Mongols raided were equally homogeneous in their official faith and considerably less tolerant of deviation from it. The supposedly barbaric horsemen from the Mongolian steppe had built, almost accidentally, a more religiously open society than any of the great civilizations surrounding them. There is something genuinely worth sitting with in that observation, not as a defense of everything that came with it. The destruction was real, and its consequences for millions of people were catastrophic, in ways that no amount of religious tolerance can offset or balance. But as a fact, standing on its own, it demands acknowledgement. Genghis Khan, the man who burned libraries and emptied cities and set the course of history by force of arms and organized terror, created within his empire a space for human spiritual diversity that his more civilized contemporaries consistently failed to provide. History is rarely comfortable. This is one of the reasons it is worth knowing. The man behind the myth, personality, justice, and the Yasa history does something to remarkable people. It smooths them out. It transforms the complicated, contradictory, sometimes baffling human beings they actually were into clean symbols, either of greatness or of evil, and the messy reality of who they were disappears under the weight of what they meant. Genghis Khan has suffered this fate more than almost anyone. He's either the greatest conqueror in history or the greatest monster. And both of these assessments, while not entirely wrong, are incomplete to the point of being misleading. So let us try to look at the man himself, insofar as the sources allow. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, physically imposing, tall for a Mongol of his time, with a commanding presence that contemporaries found difficult to look away from. His eyes were described as having an unusual light quality. He was capable of extraordinary charm and generosity toward people he liked, and people he wanted to attract, and capable of cold, total, and complete violence toward those who violated the codes he lived by. He laughed. This sounds like a strange thing to note, but it is worth noting because the weight of his historical reputation can make him seem like a kind of implacable force rather than a person. He had a sense of humour. He valued wit in his companions and appreciated people who could speak to him directly rather than simply agreeing with everything he said. He famously kept advisors around him who would argue with him, though within limits, because he understood that yes men were useless and dangerous. He valued honest counsel, and said so explicitly. He was intensely loyal to the people who had been loyal to him in the hard years before his rise. The Conqueror who had attached themselves to him when he was nobody were never forgotten. He returned favours and kept promises in a world where breaking promises was entirely normal. This quality, which sounds small, was actually enormous in its political impact, because it made allegiance to him worth something. A man who knew that Genghis Khan would remember a good deed done in the past had every reason to do good deeds, because there was a real expectation of eventual recognition. He was equally consistent in the other direction. Betrayal was unforgivable. Those who had betrayed previous masters and came offering their services to him were executed, regardless of the value of what they were offering. His reasoning was explicit. A man who betrayed one master would betray another. Better to lose the service than to accept the risk. There are numerous examples of this throughout his career, and the consistency of it suggests deep principle rather than occasional policy. His family life was complex. He had 4 sons by Borte who were recognized as his primary heirs: Yoshi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. He also had numerous other wives and concubines, as was customary for a man of his power on the steppe, and children by several of them. The relationship with his sons was not always smooth. Yochi's ambiguous paternity has already been mentioned. Chagatai was brilliant but difficult, and had an abrasive relationship with Jochi that created real problems in succession planning. Ogedei was Genghis Khan's preferred successor, a genial, capable man who drank too much, which Genghis Khan worried about, and apparently discussed with Ogedei directly. The Yasa, the law code of the Mongol Empire, is one of the most discussed and least well documented aspects of Genghis Khan's governance. No complete version of the Yasa has survived, if indeed a single comprehensive written code ever existed. What we know of it comes from references and chronicles and accounts by writers who had contact with the Mongol Empire. The Yasa appears to have been a combination of customary steppe law and new regulations established by Genghis Khan himself, governing military conduct, political behaviour and social relations. What is clear from the various sources is that the Yasa was taken extremely seriously, and that violations were punished with complete consistency, regardless of the violator's status. The son of a Khan and the son of a common soldier were held to the same standards under the Yasa, and this was not simply a theoretical principle. There are examples of members of the Mongol royal family being punished for violations of the law, which would have been nearly inconceivable under most other political systems of the time. Certain principles of the Yasa are consistently reported across multiple sources. Lying was a serious offence. Theft within the Mongol community was punishable by death or very severe penalties. Urinating into running water was prohibited, reflecting both religious belief about water's sacred nature and practical concerns about water quality. Assistance to an escaped prisoner was punishable. Eating in the presence of another without sharing was forbidden. All of these speak to a society that valued communal obligation, honesty, and the sanctity of certain natural resources. There is also the often cited tolerance toward other religions and the exemption of clergy from taxation, which appears to have been a formal Yasa provision rather than simply a preference or policy. Religious tolerance was not just something Genghis Khan happened to practice, it was apparently law. The contradictions in the man are real and should not be papered over. He ordered the deaths of millions. He presided over the destruction of civilizations. He himself acknowledged the pleasure he took in victory and conquest, reportedly saying at some point that the greatest joy a man could have was to defeat his enemies, drive them before him, take from them that which was precious, and hear the lamentation of those who held them dear. This is not a misquote. It is attributed to him across multiple sources and sounds genuinely like the sentiment of a man who had spent his life at war. He was also a man who genuinely loved his core family and friends, who created institutional frameworks that protected ordinary people from arbitrary cruelty, and who believed with total sincerity that he was doing the will of heaven. He contained all of these things simultaneously, which is perhaps the most human thing about him. The comfort of a simple verdict, either monster or hero, is not available. Life on the move. Daily life in the Mongol Empire. Between the battles and the campaigns and the political dramas, there were millions of ordinary people living ordinary lives within the Mongol world. It is easy, when following the trajectory of conquest and empire, to lose sight of what daily existence actually looked like for the men, women and children who made up the Mongol people. So let us step back from the battlefield for a moment and look at the world from inside the Jur. The Jur was the centre of Mongol domestic life, and it was a remarkably sophisticated piece of engineering for a dwelling that could be assembled and disassembled in less than an hour. A standard Jur was perhaps 15 to 20 feet in diameter, circular, with walls of wooden lattice and a felt covering of multiple layers. The roof had a central opening called the tuno that served as both skylight and smoke hole for the central hearth. In good weather, the opening could be left wide. In bad weather, a felt flap could be drawn over it. The interior was warm even in severe cold, the felt providing excellent insulation, and the central fire generating enough heat to keep the inhabitants comfortable. The arrangement of the interior was not random. Entering through the door, which faced south, the right side was the masculine side where weapons and saddles and tools were kept. The left side was the feminine domain, where food, cooking implements and household goods were stored. The hearth in the centre was sacred, the spirit of the household. Throwing anything into the hearth other than fuel was a serious offence. Poking the fire with a knife was forbidden. Stepping on the threshold of the door brought bad luck, and guests were careful to step over it rather than on it. These small ritual observances structured time and space within the Jur and connected daily life to a framework of spiritual meaning. Horses were the first thing in the morning and the last thing at night. The herds that sustained a Mongol family were the foundation of their economy and their mobility. Children grew up responsible for specific animals. Young boys began riding as soon as they could hold on, and the horsemanship skills they developed were extraordinary by any standard. Riding was not simply transport. It was how you herded your animals, how you hunted, how you fought, and how you displayed status. A man who could not ride was barely a man in the Mongol understanding of things. The mare's milk fermented into arag was truly central to Mongol life, and drinking it was both a practical nutrition source and a social ritual. Airag production happened in large bags made from animal skin. The milk churned and fermented over days to produce the mildly alcoholic drink. Offering airag to a guest was a gesture of hospitality, and refusing it was a serious social misstep. It was also, reportedly, an acquired taste. Foreign visitors to Mongol camps consistently described airag in terms that suggest considerable ambivalence about the flavour. Marco Polo's description of it is particularly careful in its diplomacy. You can almost feel him trying to be polite. Women in Mongol society occupied a position that would have surprised, and perhaps shocked, many contemporaries from the settled world. This is important enough to dwell on. Mongol women managed the household, including the substantial economic activity of managing herds and goods. When their husbands went on campaign, which given the frequency of Mongol military campaigns was a very large portion of the time, women ran everything. They negotiated, traded, made decisions about migration and grazing, and managed the complex social and economic life of the family. This gave Mongol women a practical authority that was far greater than their formal status might suggest. Women could and did speak in councils. Hoelun, Genghis Khan's mother, was a powerful political figure whose influence on her son's decisions was real. Borte's advice was sought and taken seriously. The famous case of Sorkaktani Beki, daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan and mother of 3 of the most important later Mongol rulers, demonstrates how far a capable woman could operate in the Mongol world. She was widely considered one of the most able political minds of her generation, and both Muslim and Chinese sources describe her with unconcealed admiration and occasionally with the barely concealed discomfort of men who found it difficult to explain why they were admiring a woman so much. The role of children in Mongol society was intensely practical. There was relatively little of the extended protected childhood that later more affluent societies would develop. Children had responsibilities early. They herded animals, they helped with the jur, they learned the skills of survival from adults who needed them to learn quickly. Education was oral. Stories, genealogies, songs, and practical knowledge were transmitted through memory and repetition. Writing was rare in early Mongol society, though Genghis Khan had a script created for the Mongolian language shortly after his rise to power, specifically because empire required written records. The rhythm of the Mongol year followed the seasons in ways that were highly structured. Spring was the time of new animals, new milk, and movement to summer pastures. Summer was a time of relative abundance when the herds fattened and airag flowed freely. Autumn was the time of hunting, of laying in stored food for winter, of moving toward winter camps in sheltered valleys. Winter was the hard time, when survival depended on what had been stored and prepared, and when the skills of the jur, its warmth and its management, were the difference between life and death. Hunting was not recreation for Mongols. Well, it was also recreation, but it was primarily training. The great hunts that Genghis Khan organized were called nerj, and they were essentially military exercises on a vast scale. Hundreds or thousands of riders would form a great circle across an enormous area of landscape, and then slowly contract it, driving all the animals within into a shrinking space. The discipline required to maintain the circle over days and across miles of terrain was exactly the same discipline required to maintain military formations and execute complex battlefield maneuvers. The nerj was a weapon of training disguised as a hunt. The greatest joy on a hunt, Genghis Khan is quoted as saying, was the complete surround. This was a life of beauty and hardship in equal and inseparable measure. The sky was vast. The grass was green in summer and golden in autumn. The horses were beautiful. The stars at night in the Mongolian steppe are still among the most magnificent in the world, unobstructed by light pollution, visible from horizon to horizon. The cold could kill you and the winter could break you, and the political insecurity of the steppe world meant that what you had today might be gone tomorrow. But it was alive in a way that the settled world, with its walls and its routines, perhaps was not. The return to China, the final campaign against the Jin. In the years following the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan turned his attention back toward China. The Jin dynasty was still standing. The campaigns of 1211 through 1215 had devastated northern China and taken the northern capital, but the Jin had regrouped behind the Yellow River, established a new capital at Kaifeng, and continued to function as a state. They had rebuilt some of their military. They had not forgiven, and neither had Genghis Khan. The renewed campaign against the Jin was not simply about revenge or the satisfaction of completion, though both were present. It was about resources and about the logic of empire. a rival state on the empire's southern flank nursing its wounds and rebuilding its strength, was a strategic threat that could not be left unaddressed indefinitely. The Jin had to be finished. The campaign required more than cavalry. The Jin cities were enormous and well fortified, particularly Kaifeng, which was among the largest cities in the world and had defences that could sustain a very long siege. The Mongol army that moved against the Jin in the last years of Genghis Khan's reign was therefore a genuinely combined arms force in a way that the early Mongol army had not been. It included massive siege trains, engineers from China and from Persia and Central Asia, rocket and fire weapons borrowed from the Chinese military tradition, and administrative staff capable of governing the territories taken rather than simply looting them and moving on. The role of non-Mongol soldiers and specialists in the later campaigns of the empire is sometimes underemphasized because it complicates the clean image of the nomadic horde sweeping everything before it on horseback. But the truth is that by the time of the final Jin campaigns, the Mongol army had absorbed military technology and administrative practice from half a dozen civilizations. It was, in a very real sense, no longer purely a Mongolian army. It was an army that happened to have Mongols at its core and in its leadership positions, but which drew its capabilities from a much wider human pool. The administrative side of the campaign was equally sophisticated. Genghis Khan had by this point a sense that conquest without governance was simply expensive destruction, and destruction, however satisfying as a demonstration of power, did not generate the tax revenue and tribute that sustained an empire. He had Uyghur and Chinese administrators working in his court. He had a postal relay system, the Yam, that allowed communications to move rapidly across the enormous distances of the empire. He had standards of taxation and governance that were applied to newly conquered territories. The actual campaigns against the Jin during these final years of Genghis Khan's life were conducted largely by his generals, particularly Mughali, who was given effective command of the Chinese front and prosecuted it with considerable skill. Mughali campaigned in northern China year after year with forces that were increasingly supplemented by Chinese troops, many of them defectors from the Jin who had concluded that the Mongols were winning and that the practical benefits of switching sides outweighed the costs. This influx of Chinese soldiers and administrators accelerated the process by which the Mongol presence in China became something more than an occupation and began to resemble governance. The Jin never fully recovered. Their economy was devastated. Their agricultural base in the north, which had sustained millions of people and funded the dynasty's military, was wrecked. Disease, famine, and the continual pressure of Mongol raids wore down both population and morale. The final collapse of the Jin dynasty would not come until 1234, 7 years after Genghis Khan's death, when Ogedei completed the conquest. But the essential work of making it inevitable was done in these final years. There is something worth noting about the human cost of the China campaigns that is separate from the Khwarezm campaigns but equally sobering. The population of northern China fell dramatically in the decades of Mongol warfare. Contemporary Chinese sources describe provinces emptied of their inhabitants, cities standing silent, fields untended. The infrastructure of one of the world's most sophisticated agricultural civilizations simply fallen to pieces. The demographic catastrophe of the Mongol invasion of China is, in absolute numbers, one of the largest in human history. The Mongols did not set out to kill everyone. They set out to conquer and to profit, but the practical consequence of their methods, the scorched earth tactics, the destruction of irrigation systems, the famine that followed disrupted agriculture, the disease that followed crowded refugees, was death on a scale that staggered contemporaries and still staggers historians. And yet even here, the story is not simple, because among the outcomes of the Mongol presence in China was also the preservation of Chinese cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost in the wars between Chinese states. Mongol rulers were not interested in destroying Chinese culture, they were interested in using it, and so books were preserved, scholars were kept, artisans were protected, and some of the products of Chinese civilization survived precisely because they were useful to the people who had conquered the civilization that produced them. The death of the great Khan, mystery, legacy, and the funeral. In 1227, Genghis Khan died. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old, which by the standards of the time was a substantial life, particularly for a man who had spent most of it on horseback, in conditions that would have finished most people at 40. He died on campaign, during the final reckoning with the Western Siya, the Tangut kingdom that had refused to provide troops for the Khwarezmian campaign years earlier. Genghis Khan had made them a promise in response to that refusal. He would come back. He always came back. And in 1227, he did. The Western Jia, already severely weakened from earlier campaigns, were collapsing before the Mongol advance. The outcome was not in doubt. But Genghis Khan did not live to see it completed. Somewhere in the dusty heat of the campaign, the greatest conqueror the world had ever known stopped, and did not get up again. The cause of his death is one of history's genuinely unresolved questions, and it will probably remain that way. The sources disagree with each other, which is not surprising. They were written at different times, from different perspectives, with different political needs and different audiences in mind, and the death of a figure as significant as Genghis Khan attracted the kind of storytelling embellishment that tends to accumulate around enormous events. Everyone wanted their version to be the true one. The problem is that none of them can be confirmed. Chinese sources suggest he died of illness, possibly something contracted during the campaign itself. Dysentery and typhoid were constant companions of medieval armies on the move, and neither made exceptions for greatness. Some later accounts suggest he was wounded by an arrow, a poetic end for a man who had changed the world through archery and cavalry. And then there is the Tibetan source, the one that generated considerable excitement among historians when it surfaced, which claimed that Genghis Khan died from injuries sustained when a captured princess of the Western Jia bit him during their wedding night. I want to say this story is almost certainly apocryphal. I also want to say that it has a vividness and a certain dark narrative logic that makes it impossible to entirely dismiss without feeling that you are being slightly dull about it. The Tangut people, whose civilization was being methodically erased, finding one last act of lethal defiance through a captive woman in the Great Khan's own tent. History occasionally produces stories that are too good to be true, and yet somehow feel truer than the documented facts. This is probably one of those stories. The most prosaic explanation, and therefore probably the most likely, is that he fell from his horse at some point during the campaign and never fully recovered from the injuries. He was 60-something years old. He had been riding horses through violent campaigns since his early teens. The accumulated damage of that life, the injuries absorbed over decades, the physical demands of living in the field into old age, would have left him genuinely vulnerable in a way that he almost certainly did not acknowledge to anyone around him, because that was not the kind of man he was. A fall that a younger man would have survived with bruised ribs and wounded pride may simply have been too much for a body that had already given everything it had for 60 years. What is certain, regardless of cause, is that he knew he was dying, and he used whatever time remained to do what he had always done. He organized, he planned, he made decisions that would outlast him. He named Ogedei as his successor, though he understood, because he had built the system himself and knew exactly how it worked, that the Kurultai, the Great Assembly, would have to confirm this choice formally. He gave instructions for what was to happen to the Western Jia once their resistance ended. He reportedly stated that the name of the Tanguts was to be completely extinguished after his death, meaning their people were to be scattered and their culture wiped from the record. This was the final expression of an old grievance and a political calculation delivered from a deathbed. It was carried out with brutal completeness by the commanders who survived him. He gave his sons and commanders a final address. The sources preserve versions of this speech with varying degrees of detail, and the exact words as recorded centuries later should be treated with the appropriate historical skepticism. But the substance of what he said is consistent across accounts. He told them to be of one mind. He told them to care for each other. He told them to remember that their strength, all of it, everything they had built and everything they might yet build, came from their unity and could be undone by their division. This was not sentiment. This was a man who had spent the better part of 5 decades watching alliances form and shatter on the steppe, who had seen his own childhood obliterated by the defection of his father's followers, who understood in his bones what happened to power when it turned on itself. He was right to say it. He was also right to worry that saying it would not be enough. He could not solve the problem of succession from beyond the grave. Nobody ever can. His body was transported back north to Mongolia, to the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun. This was the mountain where he had hidden as a young man, frightened and hunted, praying to Tengri in the darkness. It was the mountain he had returned to before his campaigns, to pray, to think, to align himself with heaven before the violence of the world resumed. That he should rest there was appropriate in ways that did not require explanation to the people who carried him home. The burial was conducted in total secrecy, as Mongol custom demanded for the burial of a great leader. The location was deliberately concealed. The stories about the lengths taken to preserve that concealment range from the sober to the spectacular. The most dramatic account claims that the funeral escort killed every person they encountered along the route, so that no living witness could identify the path or the place. 1,000 horses were reportedly driven back and forth across the burial site to obscure it. Whether these specific details are entirely accurate is impossible to verify, but they reflect something real about the intent. The secrecy was complete, and it was permanent, and it succeeded absolutely. The grave of Genghis Khan has never been found. 8 centuries of searching, including modern expeditions with satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, have produced nothing definitive. The mountain region of Burkhan Khaldun in northeastern Mongolia is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected not only by law but by a cultural reverence that has persisted across the generations. Mongolian tradition actively discourages searching for the tomb. There is a sense that to find it would be to violate something that was meant to remain hidden, a privacy granted to the dead that the living should not disturb. Somewhere beneath the Mongolian earth, in a location that has defeated every attempt to find it, lies the man who changed the shape of the world. The grass grows above him. The Onon River runs nearby. The blue sky of Tengri extends overhead as it always has, indifferent and eternal. The mourning that followed his death was enormous and genuine. The people who had known him, not the subjects who feared him or the conquered peoples who hated him, but the men and women who had followed him from the hard years before the rise, who had ridden with him and eaten with him and survived impossible things alongside him, felt his absence as something physical. The secret history of the Mongols, the chronicle written within a generation of his death by Mongol writers who had access to people who had known him personally, records the grief with a directness that moves across the centuries without losing its force. His wives mourned. His generals mourned. The people of the steppe mourned. In a culture where a Khan was not merely a political ruler but a spiritual one, the chosen instrument of Tengri's will made visible in the world, the death of Genghis Khan was not simply a political transition. It was a rupture in the cosmic order, a moment when the sky itself seemed to have lost something. And then, because this is how history works and has always worked, the empire had to go on without him. The tents were struck, the horses were turned, the armies continued their campaigns, the administrators continued administering, the traders continued trading, the relay riders continued riding, carrying messages across distances that would have taken months in any other political system. The machinery he had built kept turning, because he had built it well enough to turn without him. That was perhaps the truest measure of what he had achieved. Not the conquests, extraordinary as they were, not the sheer territorial scale, incomprehensible as it remains, but the fact that the thing he had built from nothing, from a childhood of poverty and captivity and abandonment on the Mongolian steppe, outlasted the man himself and kept reshaping the world for another century after he was gone. He came from nothing. He built everything. And when he died in the dust of a campaign he did not live to finish, what he left behind was still the largest empire the world had ever seen. The world he left behind. The Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan. The empire that Genghis Khan left behind in 1227 was the largest land empire the world had ever seen, and it was still growing. He had laid the foundations. His sons and grandsons would build the walls and the roof, and eventually tear the house apart in argument over who got which room. But for several decades after his death, the expansion of the Mongol Empire continued on a scale that makes the conquests of the founder himself look almost modest. Ugadi Khan, who succeeded his father after the Kurultai of 1229 confirmed the succession, was a genuinely capable ruler whose reputation has suffered somewhat from comparison with his father and his more dramatic successors. He was not as military a genius as Genghis Khan had been. He was not as strategically visionary as Subutai, but he was politically skilled, administratively thoughtful, and possessed of a quality that the Mongol Empire badly needed after the cataclysm of the founding campaigns. He was good at governing, not just conquering. Ogedei completed the destruction of the Jin dynasty in 1234, ending that long chapter. He continued and expanded Mongol campaigns in Korea, which had been raided but not conquered under Genghis Khan. He established the Mongol capital at Karakorum, building a city that was modest by the standards of the civilizations the Mongols had conquered, but enormous by the standards of what had previously existed on the Mongolian steppe. Karakorum was not a great city in the tradition of Samarkand or Zhongdu, but it was a real city with palaces, temples for multiple religions, markets attended by merchants from across the known world, and a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reflected the empire's extraordinary geographic reach. The Great Western Campaign was Ogeday's most consequential strategic achievement, and it was prosecuted by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan through his son Yoshi, and by the indestructible Subutai. Between 1237 and 1242, the Mongol Western Army swept through Russia, Poland, Hungary, and into the Adriatic coast, defeating every army placed before them with such comprehensive ease that European Christendom came genuinely close to complete military collapse. The Russian campaign was devastating. Kiev, the most important city of the Rus principalities and one of the great cities of medieval Europe, was sacked in 1240. Contemporary accounts describe a city of perhaps 50,000 people, reduced to rubble and scattered bones. A Hungarian friar visiting the ruins a few years later described a landscape of skulls and shattered buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly. Poland was invaded simultaneously, its armies defeated. The united armies of the Holy Roman Empire's knights and Polish forces met the Mongols at the Battle of Legnica in 1241 and were destroyed. Hungary's royal army was annihilated at the Battle of Mohi in the same year. The Mongol forces reached the Adriatic Sea. They stood at the gates of Vienna. They were raiding through what is now Austria, and then they stopped. They turned around and went east. Why? This is one of the great questions of European history, because the obvious implication is that if the Mongols had continued westward, rather than retreating, the history of Western Europe would have been very different. The traditional answer, which may or may not be entirely accurate, is that Ogeday Khan had died in December of 1241, and Batu and Subutai had to return for the Kurultai that would determine his successor. The Western campaign was not abandoned. It was paused, and then it was never resumed at the same scale. The succession after Ogeday was troubled. Guyuk, Ogeday's son, became Khan, but was in conflict with Batu over a political dispute that had festered for years. Guyuk died, possibly of illness, possibly not entirely coincidentally, before any resolution of this conflict could occur. Mongke, son of Tolui, eventually became Great Khan with the support of Batu, and it was under Mongke that the empire reached its territorial maximum extent and also began the processes of internal stress that would eventually fracture it. Mongke sent his brother Hulagu westward to complete the conquest of the Islamic heartland. Hulagu's campaign reached and sacked Baghdad in 1258, killing the Caliph, ending the Abbasid Caliphate, which had been the political and spiritual centre of Sunni Islam for 5 centuries, and generally causing a shock in the Islamic world comparable to what the sack of Rome had caused in the Latin Christian world 8 centuries earlier. That is not an exaggeration. The Abbasid Caliphate and the City of Peace were to the Islamic world what Rome and its spiritual authority were to Christendom. Their destruction in 1258 reverberated through Islamic culture for centuries. Mongke sent his brother Kublai eastward to finish the conquest of China, and Mongke died on campaign against the Song dynasty in 1259, which is where the main line of the expansion stopped and the fragmentation began in earnest. Pax Mongolica. The unexpected peace. Here is the thing about the Mongol Empire that never quite fits into the story when the story is told primarily through conquest and destruction. The Mongol Empire, at its height, created something that was, in many respects, extraordinary. Not good in any simple moral sense, but extraordinary. And its consequences for the connected world were far-reaching in ways that no one fully anticipated at the time, and that historians still debate today. The phenomenon is called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. It refers to the period of roughly a century from approximately 1250 to 1250, when the Mongol Empire controlled such a vast swathe of Eurasia that travel and trade across the continent was possible in a way that had not been possible before and would not be possible again for centuries. The Silk Road had always existed theoretically. The routes that connected China to the Mediterranean world had been in use for over 1,000 years before Genghis Khan was born, but they had never been entirely safe. The various kingdoms and polities through which they passed had different laws, different attitudes toward foreign merchants, different standards of safety. A merchant travelling from the Chinese coast to the markets of Persia crossed multiple different political boundaries, each with its own taxes, its own hazards, its own potential for arbitrary seizure of goods or violence against travellers. Under the Mongol Empire, you could travel from Karakorum to the Black Sea under a single political authority. The postal relay system that had begun as a military communication network became a commercial infrastructure. Caravanserais, rest stops for travelling merchants, were established and maintained across the empire. Merchants carried documents called paises, tablets of gold or silver or iron depending on the bearer's status, that granted them safe conduct and access to food and horses along the route. The physical infrastructure of long-distance trade had never been better. The result was a period of extraordinary commercial and cultural exchange. Goods moved across Eurasia in quantities and at speeds that were genuinely new. Chinese silk went west, Persian glass went east, Indian spices moved in both directions, information, ideas, technologies, and artistic styles travelled with the goods. Paper money, a Chinese invention, was introduced in the West. Persian astronomical and mathematical knowledge reached China. Islamic medical texts moved east and west simultaneously. The cosmopolitan cultures of the major Mongol court cities, Karakorum, Khanbalik under Kublai, Tabriz under the Ilkhanate, became points of synthesis where knowledge from every tradition in Eurasia mingled. Marco Polo, whose account of his travels in the Mongol Empire in the 1370s and 80s has been debated and disputed and half-believed for 7 centuries, was a product of this world. The fact that an Italian merchant could travel overland from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan and return, and that this was not a suicidal undertaking, but simply a very long and difficult commercial journey, tells you something essential about what the Pax Mongolica had created. Whether Marco Polo was entirely truthful in his account of his travels is less important than the fact that the journey itself was possible. The Mongol courts were also remarkable centres of religious pluralism. Under Kublai Khan in China, Buddhists, Confucians, Taoists, Christians and Muslims all found patronage and protection. Hulagu's court in Persia included his Nestorian Christian wife, Muslim scholars, Buddhist monks, and Jewish physicians. The breadth of the cultural synthesis happening in these courts was genuinely without parallel in the medieval world. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan friar sent to the Mongol court as an envoy by Louis IX of France in 1253, wrote one of the most detailed and thoughtful eyewitness accounts of Mongol life that survives. His description of a formal religious debate held at the court of the Great Khan, in which Buddhist, Muslim, Christian and shamanist representatives argued their positions before the assembled court, is one of the most astonishing documents of the medieval world. The Great Khan judged the debate. The representatives were civil, nobody was executed. This was the Mongol court conducting interfaith dialogue in 1254. The Fourth Lateran Council had demanded that Jews wear identifying clothing in 1215. These were not entirely equivalent civilizational projects. And then there was the other thing that travelled along the Silk Road with the silks and the spices and the ideas and the merchants, the thing that no one had planned and no one would have chosen to export: the plague, the Black Death, the great pandemic that killed between a third and half of Europe's population between 1247 and 1353, and comparable proportions in the Islamic world and China, travelled along the very trade routes that the Pax Mongolica had made so efficient. The disease Yersinia pestis was endemic in the rodent populations of Central Asia. The Mongol movements and the subsequent increase in long-distance trade and the flow of people along connected routes gave it the highway it needed to reach populations that had no immunity and no understanding of what was happening to them. The Pax Mongolica, in this terrible way, made the Black Death possible. The connection of the world that was one of the Mongol Empire's most consequential gifts was also the mechanism by which the most devastating pandemic in recorded history reached its full global horror. There is no way to hold these two things apart. They are the same phenomenon. The fall of the Mongol Empire, fragmentation and collapse. Great empires do not usually collapse dramatically. They fracture. They develop internal tensions that pull them in different directions simultaneously. They face external pressures at moments when the internal tensions leave them unable to respond effectively. They lose the shared identity that had bound their diverse components together. They fragment into successors that each claim the original authority, none of them entirely wrong and none of them entirely right. And eventually the successors stop looking back at the source and simply become what they have become. This is, roughly, what happened to the Mongol Empire. The fragmentation was already implicit in the imperial structure from the beginning. Genghis Khan had divided his realm among his sons, a common practice across Eurasian political culture that reflected both the practical demands of governance over vast distances and the cultural expectation that a father's wealth would be divided among his children. The 4 great Khanates that eventually emerged from the single Mongol Empire, the Yuan dynasty in China under the descendants of Kublai, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Middle East under the descendants of Hulagu, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia under the descendants of Chagatai, and the Golden Horde on the Pontic steppe under the descendants of Jochi had all been implicit in Genghis Khan's original divisions. These Khanats did not remain on friendly terms. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate were in a state of persistent warfare over territory and resources. The Yuan and the Chagatai Khanate had their own conflicts. The great unity that Genghis Khan had forged through sheer personal authority and the momentum of conquest began to dissolve as soon as there was no single figure commanding universal allegiance. Religion was also a factor in the differentiation of the Khanates. The Golden Horde under Berke Khan, Batu's brother, converted to Islam in the 1250s, becoming the first Mongol Khanate to adopt a world religion as its official faith. The Ilkhanate initially favoured Christianity and Buddhism before eventually converting to Islam under Ghazan in 1295. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai patronised Tibetan Buddhism while maintaining Confucian governance. These different religious trajectories made cultural synthesis across the Khanates increasingly difficult, and gave each one a distinct identity that was less Mongol and more the product of the civilization it had conquered. The administrative absorption was perhaps the most important factor in the long-term transformation. Conquerors who govern settled civilizations tend to become, over generations, more like the civilizations they govern. The Mongol rulers of China surrounded themselves with Chinese administrators, adopted Chinese court ceremonies, learned Chinese language and literature, and increasingly saw themselves through a Chinese lens. The Mongol rulers of Persia surrounded themselves with Persian administrators, adopted Persian court culture, patronized Persian art and literature, and increasingly became Persian rulers who happened to have Mongol ancestry. The rulers of the Golden Horde on the steppe remained more recognizably Mongolian in their culture, but even they experienced constant influence from the Russian, Cuman, and Turkic populations within their realm. By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire was effectively four separate powers that happened to share an ancestor. They fought each other, traded with each other, sometimes allied with each other, and occasionally cooperated on specific interests. But they were no longer a unified political entity in any meaningful sense. The Black Death hit the Mongol world as hard as it hit everyone else, possibly harder in some respects because the trade routes that the Mongols had created and maintained were the very routes along which the plague travelled. The Mongol ruling class, no less mortal than anyone else, suffered enormous losses. The administrative and military capacity of the Khanates was depleted at precisely the moment when they faced both internal rebellions and external challenges. In China, the Yuan dynasty faced a series of massive popular rebellions in the mid-14th century. The Red Turban Rebellion, already mentioned briefly in our discussion of the Ming dynasty, was partly directed against Mongol rule and the social inequalities it had institutionalized. In 1268, a man of peasant origins named Zhu Yunjiang drove the last Yuan emperor back to the steppe and established the Ming dynasty. The Mongols returned to the grasslands they had left a century and a half earlier, resuming nomadic life as if the empire had been a long and eventful adventure from which they had now returned home. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fragmented into successor states after the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335. Various local dynasties, some of Mongol origin and some not, divided the former Ilkhanate territory among them. The magnificent cultural synthesis of the Ilkhanate court, where Persian literature and Islamic theology and Buddhist iconography and Chinese artistic motifs had produced something genuinely new and remarkable, dissolved into regional traditions that drew on the synthesis without being shaped by it in the same way. The Golden Horde lasted longer than the other Khanates, continuing as a significant power through the 14th and into the 15th century. Its defeat at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380 by a coalition of Russian princes under Dmitry Donskoy was later mythologized as a turning point, though the Golden Horde itself survived another century before finally fragmenting into smaller successor Khanates, the Khanate of Crimea, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan. These successor Khanates persisted until Russian expansion absorbed them in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Chagatai Khanate persisted in various forms in Central Asia and would eventually be partially reconstituted by Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, who was not of Chinggisid descent but claimed legitimacy through his Mongol connections and recreated, briefly and devastatingly, something of the Mongol Empire's reach in the late 14th century. Timur's campaigns were in some ways a grim revival of the Mongol tradition of conquest by absolute violence, and his memory in Central Asia and the Middle East is hardly more positive than that of Genghis Khan himself. The Mongol Empire did not so much fall as dissolve. It dissolved into the cultures it had conquered, leaving enormous marks on each of them. It dissolved into successor states that each carried something of the original within them while becoming something new. It dissolved into history, into legend, into the complicated mixture of awe and horror with which it has been regarded ever since. The legacy of Genghis Khan. How one man reshaped the world. What does a person have to do to genuinely change the world? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a serious one. Because most people who are called world historical figures in the traditional sense, the great generals and emperors and statesmen, operated within existing systems and modified those systems at the margins. They did not change the fundamental architecture. They rearranged the furniture. Genghis Khan rearranged the building itself. The most immediate and obvious legacy is geographic and political. The map of Central Asia, the Middle East, East Asia, and Eastern Europe was redrawn by the Mongol conquests in ways that persisted for centuries, dynasties that the Mongols established, like the Yuan in China and the Ilkhanate in Persia, shaped the subsequent history of those regions even after Mongol rule ended. The Golden Horde's influence on Russian political culture, particularly the development of autocracy and the relationship between rulers and the governed, is a matter of serious historical debate but cannot be dismissed. Many historians have argued that Russian absolutism, the concentration of enormous power in the hands of a single ruler, without the countervailing aristocratic or ecclesiastical checks that existed in Western Europe, owes something to the political model the Russian princes encountered and were shaped by under Mongol overlordship. The linguistic legacy is also significant. Turkic languages spread across Central Asia partly through Mongol movements, as the Mongols used Turkic speakers as administrative intermediaries and military forces across the Western Empire. The presence of Turkic languages in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia today, in Turkey, in Azerbaijan and elsewhere, reflects demographic shifts that the Mongol period accelerated. The genetic legacy is the kind of fact that tends to stop conversations. Studies of Y chromosome genetics published in the early 21st century identified a specific lineage, almost certainly descending from Genghis Khan or his close male relatives, present in roughly 16 million men alive today across the former territories of the Mongol Empire. This is the most common single paternal lineage in the entire human species. The biological consequence of one man's reproductive and military career, 8 centuries later, is still detectable in 1 in 200 men on Earth. This is either impressive or disturbing or both, depending on your perspective. Genghis Khan had many wives and many concubines, as was expected of a man of his power. His sons and grandsons had the same. Over the generations of the Mongol Empire's existence, the Chinggisid royal line produced an enormous number of children, many of whom were in positions of power and thus had access to reproductive opportunities that ordinary men did not have. The 16 million figure is not the product of some specific atrocity. It is the cumulative demographic consequence of political power exercised over many generations. The commercial and economic legacy of the Pax Mongolica was substantial. The reopening of the Silk Road in its most comprehensive form, the establishment of commercial infrastructure across the continent, and the movement of goods, ideas, and people across Eurasia at volumes not previously possible, laid foundations for economic integration that would outlast the empire itself. The taste for Chinese goods that the Mongol period introduced to European courts would be a factor in the European desire to find direct sea routes to Asia, which would in turn trigger the age of exploration and the beginning of genuine globalization. The connection between the Mongol road and Columbus's ship is not direct, but it is not entirely metaphorical either. The cultural exchange facilitated by the Pax Mongolica is harder to measure, but possibly even more significant. The transmission of Chinese papermaking, printing, and gunpowder technology to the Islamic world, and from there to Europe, changed the course of history in ways that require no exaggeration. Paper made books cheap, printing made them mass-producible, gunpowder made the armoured knight obsolete, and began the long process of military democratization that would eventually, through many steps, lead to the citizen soldier and then to the nation-state. The Mongols did not intend any of this. They were simply moving things around as part of empire, and the things moved included technologies with enormous consequential power. The legal legacy is sometimes overlooked but is real. The principle of religious tolerance embedded in the yasa, the meritocratic approach to appointment and promotion, and the use of law as a universal standard that applied to rulers as well as ruled, were sophisticated ideas that left traces in the governance of successor states. The Ilkhanate administrative practices influenced Persian governance for centuries. The Yuan's administrative structures influenced Chinese governance. The idea that law applied universally was not always honoured in practice, but its articulation as a principle, in a world where such ideas were genuinely rare, had its own kind of consequence. There is also the legacy of the man as a symbol, which is a distinct thing from the legacy of what he actually did. Genghis Khan means different things to different peoples today. In Mongolia, he is the founding father, the national hero, the man who took a fragmented pastoral people and made them the centre of the world. His image is on the currency. His name is on airports and vodka and government buildings. He's regarded with a pride that is fierce and entirely comprehensible, given Mongolia's subsequent history of being swallowed up by larger powers. In Central Asia and the Middle East, where the memory of the Mongol destruction is preserved in popular consciousness with a vividness that 8 centuries have not dimmed, the name carries a different weight. Cities like Samarkand have rebuilt and flourished, but the memory of what was lost, the libraries, the scholars, the irreplaceable cultural heritage, persists as a wound in the collective historical consciousness of the Islamic world that is never entirely closed. In China, the relationship with the Mongol period is complex and nuanced in ways that a simple, positive or negative verdict cannot capture. The Yuan dynasty is both part of Chinese history and a period of foreign domination, a complexity that Chinese historiography has navigated differently at different political moments. The contemporary Chinese state tends to emphasize the Mongol period as part of a unified national story in which all of China's ethnic groups, including the Mongols, are part of the larger Chinese family. Mongolian scholars and Mongolian popular culture emphasize it somewhat differently. In the Western academic tradition, the evaluation of Genghis Khan has shifted substantially over the centuries. The most common initial response was the one that the Islamic and Chinese sources embedded in Western consciousness through translation. Catastrophist, seeing the Mongols primarily as destroyers of civilization. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a counter-narrative has emerged that emphasizes the constructive and connective aspects of the Mongol period. Jack Weatherford's biography, published in 2004 and widely read, made a strong case for Genghis Khan as a modernizing and connecting force. This counter-narrative has been criticized by some historians as overcorrecting, presenting too positive a picture of what was, after all, genuinely catastrophic for millions of people. The truth is probably that neither pure catastrophism nor pure rehabilitation is adequate. Genghis Khan presided over both enormous destruction and remarkable construction. He killed millions and connected civilizations. He created a law code of surprising sophistication and applied it in the same governance that also executed entire populations for resisting. He was genuinely tolerant of religious diversity and genuinely ruthless toward political opposition. He cared about his family with evident depth and ordered atrocities that go beyond anything we can neutrally describe. All of these things were simultaneously true of him, and the discomfort of holding them all at once is perhaps the most honest response available. His world, the world of the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century, produced a certain kind of human being. Hard, pragmatic, loyal to those who proved loyal, merciless to those who did not, capable of extraordinary generosity and extraordinary violence in roughly equal measure. That kind of human being, given the specific combination of intelligence, charisma, organizational genius, and historical timing that Temüjin happened to possess, became Genghis Khan. He changed the world, permanently, irreversibly, and in ways so thoroughly interwoven with subsequent history that it is impossible to fully separate what he set in motion from what came after. The world we inhabit today, its political geography, its connected economies, its mix of civilizations and religions, bears his fingerprints in ways that are sometimes invisible but are never absent. He came from nowhere. He built everything. He died on campaign at 60-something years old. He was buried in secret under a mountain that has never been found. And 800 years later, people on every continent know his name. That is a legacy. The story of Genghis Khan is not a comfortable story. It never was, and it never will be. It is a story of violence on a scale so immense that the numbers lose their meaning, and you have to stop and remind yourself that each number was a life, a world of a person, irreplaceable and now gone. It is a story of ambition so extreme that it remade the physical and cultural geography of entire continents. It is a story of one human life, beginning in poverty and abandonment on the Mongolian steppe, running through capture and slavery and desperate survival and gradual rise, through war and more victory, and ending on campaign in the dust of northwestern China with an empire behind him larger than anything the world had seen. And it is at the same time a story that tells us something about what human beings are capable of, not only in the direction of destruction, though it tells us that too, and we should listen, but in the direction of organization, of loyalty, of the building of something from nothing, of the conviction that the impossible is simply something that has not yet been attempted with sufficient will and intelligence. Genghis Khan believed with total sincerity that heaven had chosen him to rule the world. Modern people find this kind of conviction difficult to take seriously, and there are very good reasons for that. It has been used to justify terrible things, not only by him, but by countless others who borrowed the formula. And yet there is something in the consistency of his belief, in the way it sustained him through impossible conditions and gave shape to everything he did, that is worth pausing to consider. The steppe is quiet tonight, as it has been for 8 centuries since the great banners were furled and the horses were turned back north to graze on the Mongolian grass. The Onon River still runs cold through the birch forests where a boy named Temüjin was born in the 12th century, knowing nothing about what he would become, only knowing that he had to survive another day. The vast sweep of this story has carried us from those birch forests to the walls of Vienna, from the bones of Zhongdu to the spice markets of Samarkand, from the Ger to the Forbidden City, from one man's childhood to the reshaping of the world. The scale of it is almost too large to hold, and that is perhaps appropriate, because the man himself was almost too large to hold. History has spent 800 years trying, and still hasn't quite managed it. Let the story settle now, the way sediment settles in still water, slowly finding its rest. The battles are over, the smoke has cleared. The cities have been built again, and the trade routes have found their rhythms, and the grass has grown back over the places where armies once stood. The blue sky, Tengri, is what it has always been. The stars over Mongolia tonight are what they were when a Khan lay dying on campaign in 1227. His empire behind him, the grass beneath him, and the long work of history already beginning to make something new from everything he had broken and built. Rest now. The world is still here. It was remade once on the Mongolian steppe by a boy no one expected, and it is still going. It always keeps going.